There is a moment that many clients describe in therapy, and it almost always begins with the same sentence. I don't know why, but it feels like they're still watching me. Not because there are messages, not because there are calls. In fact, there is no interaction at all. And yet, there is a subtle tension in the chest, an urge to check social media, or a quiet, persistent feeling that every step being taken is somehow being observed by someone who is no longer physically present. This phenomenon is not random, and more importantly, it is not merely irrational. Within the dynamics of a relationship involving narcissistic patterns, silence does not mean absence. In many cases, silence is the most effective strategy. It is a form of control that is invisible, yet remains active within the psychological system of the victim. What must be understood is this: when a narcissist is silent, it is not because they have stopped caring. In many instances, the opposite is true. They are observing, gathering information, and, indirectly, maintaining their influence. The problem is, the victim is almost never aware that they are still within this range. To understand this more deeply, we need to examine the mental mechanisms operating beneath this behavior. The first is what clinical psychology refers to as covert monitoring, a form of hidden surveillance. Covert monitoring is not overt observation, such as sending messages or appearing directly. It is passive observation from a distance, often through social media, shared social circles, or even through retained knowledge of the victim's behavioral patterns. A narcissist is driven by a fundamental need known as narcissistic supply, the need to feel important, powerful, and relevant in the lives of others. When a relationship ends or communication is cut off, this need does not disappear. It simply adapts. Instead of seeking supply directly, they shift toward indirect methods, such as silent observation, to maintain a sense of connection to that source. Imagine a chess player who is no longer seated at the board, yet continues to observe the game from afar. They are not moving any pieces, but they understand every move being made. More than that, they are waiting for the right moment to re-enter the game. That is covert monitoring. In practice, it can appear deceptively simple. Viewing your stories without responding, tracking changes in your status, asking about you through others, or storing past information about you for future use. However, psychologically, it is far more complex. When a narcissist engages in covert monitoring, they are maintaining what can be described as a psychological foothold, a mental position within your life. As long as they retain any level of access, no matter how small, they do not experience a full loss of control. What victims often do not realize is that their brain responds to this. Humans possess what is known as a social threat detection system, an evolved mechanism that makes us sensitive to potential social threats, including rejection, surveillance, or manipulation. This system does not always require concrete evidence. It operates based on patterns, past experiences, and intuitive recognition formed through previous interactions. So when you feel, they're still watching me, it is not simply paranoia. It is your nervous system recognizing a familiar pattern that this person once controlled, observed, and manipulated. And because that pattern has not been fully resolved psychologically, your body continues to register it as active. This is where the true power of a narcissist's silence lies. Silence creates a vacuum, and the human mind is inherently uncomfortable with emptiness. We attempt to fill it with assumptions, with worry, with over-analysis. Without realizing it, the victim begins to engage in what is called self-surveillance. They start thinking, are they seeing this? Do they know I've moved on? Do I look strong or do I look weak? Attention that should have returned to the self remains psychologically tethered to the other person. This is a form of control that is subtle, yet highly effective. A fitting analogy is that of an unseen surveillance camera. You do not know for certain whether it is active, but the mere possibility that you are being watched is enough to alter your behavior. You become more cautious, more self-aware, perhaps no longer entirely free. And that is the core objective. For a narcissist, control does not always require direct action. As long as they continue to influence how you think, feel, and behave, they still occupy a position in your life. Covert monitoring allows them to remain present without risking rejection or damaging their self-image. It is both a defensive and manipulative strategy. What makes it particularly dangerous is its invisibility. Because there is no direct contact, victims often feel that they should be fine. Yet internally, a part of them remains attached, alert, and responsive to the presence of that individual. This creates an exhausting internal conflict. Logically, the relationship has ended. But emotionally and neurologically, the system remains active. And as long as this covert monitoring persists, whether in reality or as a perceived possibility, the recovery process becomes obstructed. This is why understanding this mechanism is a crucial first step, not to instill fear, but to restore awareness. Because once you recognize that silence is not neutral, you begin to see the pattern with clarity. And from that point forward, the control that once felt intangible begins to lose its power. What follows after covert monitoring is often less visible, yet significantly more intrusive in its psychological impact. If covert monitoring is the act of watching from a distance, the next mechanism is what allows that observation to live inside you, even in the absence of the narcissist. This mechanism is known as internalized presence. At a clinical level, internalized presence refers to the process by which an external figure, especially one associated with emotional intensity, control, or unpredictability, becomes psychologically embedded within an individual's internal world. Over time, the victim no longer requires the physical presence of the narcissist to feel their influence. The observer has been internalized. In simpler terms, the narcissist no longer needs to watch you. A part of your own mind does it for them. This is not a conscious process. It develops gradually through repeated exposure to a relational dynamic characterized by inconsistency, emotional volatility, and subtle control. The brain, in its attempt to predict and adapt, begins to simulate the other person's reactions, even when they are no longer present. This is where many survivors become confused. They ask themselves, why do I still care what they think? Why do I feel judged even when they're gone? Why do I keep imagining how they would react? These are not signs of weakness. They are indicators of conditioning. To understand how this forms, we need to examine the role of intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is a well-documented psychological principle, often studied within behavioral conditioning frameworks. It occurs when rewards and punishments are delivered unpredictably rather than consistently. In the context of narcissistic relationships, this might look like alternating periods of affection and withdrawal, validation and criticism, closeness and distance. This unpredictability is not incidental, it is central. Because the human brain is wired to seek patterns, inconsistency creates a heightened state of attention. The victim becomes more focused, more alert, more invested in figuring out how to regain stability. Over time, this leads to a form of cognitive and emotional imprinting. The brain begins to encode not just the person, but the pattern of their behavior. And once that pattern is internalized, it can be replayed indefinitely. An analogy that may clarify this process is that of a voice recording loop. Imagine that, over time, someone records hundreds of variations of their voice into your mind. Some warm, some critical, some distant, some approving. At first, these voices are triggered only when the person is present, but eventually, the recording system becomes autonomous. Now, even in silence, the playback continues. You post something online and instantly a thought appears. They'll think this is attention-seeking. You make a decision, and another thought follows. They wouldn't approve of this. You begin to feel proud of your progress. And a quieter voice interrupts. It's not that impressive. These are not random intrusive thoughts. They are internalized echoes of the narcissistic dynamic. From a neuropsychological perspective, this involves the strengthening of specific neural pathways associated with threat anticipation and social evaluation. The brain, having learned that this person's reactions were unpredictable and consequential, prioritizes simulation as a protective strategy. If I can predict them, the brain assumes, I can avoid harm. The problem is, the threat is no longer external, but the simulation continues as if it were. This creates a persistent state of hypervigilance, not toward the environment, but toward one's own thoughts and behaviors. You begin to monitor yourself. You filter your expression. You anticipate judgment. And crucially, you attribute that judgment to the narcissist, even in their absence. This is where internalized presence intersects with covert monitoring. Even if the narcissist is no longer actively observing you, the possibility that they might be, combined with the internal simulation of their perspective, creates a closed psychological loop. They do not need to act. The system sustains itself. This is why many survivors report that the most difficult phase is not during the relationship, but after it ends. Because during the relationship, the source of distress is external and identifiable. After the relationship, it becomes internal and ambiguous. You cannot block a thought. You cannot distance yourself from your own mind. And so the sense of being watched persists, not as a literal reality, but as a psychological condition. It is important to emphasize that this is not pathology in the traditional sense. It is adaptation. The brain adapted to a complex and unstable relational environment by becoming more predictive, more cautious, and more self-monitoring. However, what was once adaptive becomes maladaptive when the environment changes. The narcissist is no longer present in your life, but their psychological imprint remains active within your cognitive and emotional systems. This is the silent continuation of control, not through direct manipulation, but through internalization. And until this mechanism is understood, many individuals mistakenly believe that they are not over it, or that they are somehow still emotionally dependent on the narcissist. In reality, what they are experiencing is the residue of a deeply conditioned relational pattern. The distinction is critical, because dependency implies choice, conditioning implies process, and processes can be unlearned, but only after they are recognized for what they are. This is the second layer of what it means when we say, the narcissist is watching you in silence. Sometimes the silence is not coming from them. It is coming from the space they have already occupied within you.